Chapter 51 The Husband Hunt 6. Something peered out of the darkness. A darker, heavier darkness, casting its shadow across the water. Deeper, thicker, heavier, darker, it had surely been drawn to the lights and commotion of the battlefield by Baskerville and the morgue. Here comes Madame Eight-Legged. Balak's warriors are visibly panicking. The warriors of Morgue and Baskerville realize the gravity of the situation, as do the warriors who are not known for their fearlessness. Vikier, in particular, already had some idea of what was peering out from beyond the darkness. He had seen, heard, and experienced countless incidents in the jungles of the Black Mountains with the enemy before his return. And Vikier remembered the words of an old native he had once stumbled upon while drifting in an unfortunate time. Madam with 8 legs. A piece of ghostly legend. It was a tale of untold horrors that lurked at the bottom of the water, in the depths of rotting root holes. Shish. Don't make a sound. Vikier placed his hand over Camus's lips in his arms and whispered in its ear. You may not be able to see very well, but you have sensitive ears and skin, old man. Light and sound. He's sensitive to them. Jaharik. Beyond the tangled skeins of roots in the floodwaters, a noise sounded otherworldly. It sounded like the uncomfortable groan of an old man, or the last gasp of a drowning man in a swamp. Rustling, rustling, rustling. Soon there was the sound of bristly, dense fur being swept everywhere. From the sound of it, the thing that was now approaching must be of immense size. Even the mighty Morgue Adolphe was at a loss as to what species this creature lurking in the darkness belonged to. It must be a new creature that hasn't been seen before, but how could such a monster be undiscovered? Adolphe's questions were legitimate, but Vikier, who knew how large and vast the enemy and the Black Mountains waters were, had nothing to say. He merely recited the information from his pre-reversion knowledge, information that had been refined and perfected over the course of several more editions, even in the version Adolphe now knew. Madame Eight-Legged, an annihilation-level demon, one that will grow into an even more terrifying monster in the next decade. Risk level S. Dangerous enough that a single entity is capable of destroying a nation. If we were to fight it head-on, we would have no chance. Even here, in its home base of Suhai, it's not even at night. Something sticky is dripping down from above, onto the leaves, fallen branches, and human heads. The drops of slime falling simultaneously from various locations created the illusion of drizzling rain. ... Static. Perfect static. There hadn't been a sound of a grasshopper in the water since before. And now this. The veteran swordsmen of Baskerville, the seasoned wizards of Morgue, and the fierce barbarian warriors of Balak had all been reduced to nothing more than grasshoppers. All were frozen in place, unable to breathe, praying that the great nightmare in the sky would pass quickly. Just then, a tearing scream came from the air. Vikier turned his head quickly. There, standing there, was Camus, his eyes narrowed in horror. It's not, is it? She made an X with her hands as if to say, no more embarrassment. Vikier breathes a sigh of relief. It's a Hun of Balak who's letting out a new scream. My head. Madame's poison. A Hun was running around, shaking out his hair. Was it because he quickly cut it off with a knife? On the ground, a Hun's hair is melting away. But dodging the onrushing water didn't save him from the tsunami that followed. It began to respond to his screams. A thick darkness descended upon the Balak warriors. Ian quickly grabbed a Hun by the back of the neck and ran. You fool. If you weren't the eldest son of a shaman, I would have left you. A Hun cowered, unable to utter a word as Ian growled. Soon, Balak's warriors began to scatter, spreading out across the water. Let us run. At Adolphe's words, Morgue and Baskerville's pursuers retreated. But there was a slight difference in the way the Balak, Morgue, and Baskerville alliance retreated. Balak's warriors fled individually, with none of them running in the same direction. The Morgue and Baskervilles, on the other hand, fled in unison. This slight difference helped determine the it factor. Passasosic. The sound of blade-like leaves bending so easily. A huge pile of fur was breaking through the dense foliage and thorns, heading this way. Into the room at breakneck speed. Huck. Thump. Thump. Dull noises came from all directions. It was the sound of swordsmen and mages being crushed by an unidentified attack. What the hell is that? Adolf exclaimed as he ran, scooping up his camel. Staffordshire, too, runs forward, carrying the Baskerville triplets in his arms. The triplets, who had just been knocked out by an unknown attacker, were bleeding from the corners of their mouths, their eyes wide open and glaring at it behind them. Just then, "That's it." Vikyr paused. "At this rate, we're all going to die." Vikyr spins around in his seat. Camus sees him and cries out. "Run, Vikyr, what are you doing?" She gasps in surprise. Facing Camus, Vikyr doesn't turn around, but waves his hand briefly. "Let me buy you some time. It is not an opponent that can be fought by hiding its power." And this crisis was an opportunity, a golden moment to legally slip off Hugo's radar. Vikyr instinctively sensed that the time had come to realize a plan he had long thought of. Death. And camouflage. Once a hound in the field is dead, all surveillance and control over it ceases. In his mind, he had already memorized the theories of the Baskerville 10th sword art. His mana and aura are slowly recovering to the level of his previous life. All she needs is time. A place away from prying eyes. This is the perfect place to hide and improve, so that when the time is right, she can leave and return to her family. "No, Vikyr, please come back." Camus cries out. Vikyr turns his back on the plaintive cry. In the distant future, when he is no match for Hugo, or at least when he is able to hide and control his skills perfectly, he will return to his family and perhaps be treated as a hero. At least he could claim to have sacrificed himself for the sake of Morg's feast. Vikyr straightened his posture. "Do your best, don't die." He had no intention of giving it his all against an opponent who would likely die anyway. It was just a matter of how much she could produce. Vikyr stood in front of it, in an almost sacrificial manner. "If we go on like this, we'll all die. I'll stop it for a while, so everyone run away, tell my family that I was brave at the end," and other lines that Vikyr didn't bother to say. "They must have gotten through without me." Nephew. Adolf bit his lip, a grim expression on his face. He bites his lip so tightly that it bleeds from the corner of his mouth, but he must return to his family as soon as possible to save his poisoned niece. Master. Staffordshire, also carrying the injured triplets, looked back at Vikyr with trembling eyes. Finally, Camus. She stretched out her hands toward Vikyr, her face covered in tears and snot, her expression now speechless, her throat hoarse from exhaustion. Only to be blocked from moving forward by Adolf's strong forearm. "Go." Vikyr turned his back on everyone and drew his sword. "Then, do not let my nephew's sacrifice be in vain." Adolf cried out, spitting up blood. With that, the survivors of the Morgband Baskervilles began to run away from it. Vikyr watched them all move away. And with that, the fast approaching thing broke through the darkness and leaned forward toward Vikyr. At the same time, Vikyr unleashes all the power he's been holding back. Mana, fed by the waters of the river Styx. An aura made even more refined by his newfound mastery of Baskerville-style high swordsmanship. In addition, the rare magic sword Beelzebub pierced my wrist, revealing long teeth. A pitch-black aura, red as blood and dark as the abyss, began to rampage like a demon from Beelzebub's tip. It quickly formed 5 gigantic teeth and clamped down on it. Jaw. The monster let out a startled yell. A scream, tight with pain. Quack, quack, quack. There was a flash of light like a giant sun falling. Vikyr's aura surged with power, forcing dawn into the dark waters. He didn't see Adolf and Staffordshire, who were concentrating on running forward, but Camus and the triplets, who were being carried by them and looking backward, saw through the exploding beam of light. Flash. Vikyr's ridiculous power exploding the aura of a graduator intermediate. Chapter 52 Slaves of the Savage Tribe 1. Chirp. A small bird chirped. Vikyr opened his eyes to the sunlight streaming in. The morning light stabbed painfully through her body. As Vikyr tried to sit up, he grimaced at the pain, as if his entire body had been shattered. With superhuman strength, he managed to keep his upper body upright, but getting fully to his feet was painful. Where am I? Vikyr thought back to last night, which could have been any number of days ago. He remembered hurling every ounce of his strength at the darkness under the water. Mana squeezed hard, aura burned fiercely. I'd thrown my mid-level graduator power and my magic sword, Beelzebub, at it, and the result was devastating. Defeated. Madame Eight-Legged, a gigantic demonic creature shrouded in darkness, was a creature beyond Vikir's expectations. At the crucial moment, she would have been killed if she hadn't flinched from the sudden blast of light. And for a creature that could generate such firepower, Vikir's recoil damage was not insignificant. Muscles and veins throughout his body were ruptured. The strain on the bones that had to support them was even worse. The bones of the fingers and forearms that gripped the sword were shattered by comminuted fractures, and the sharp points of spiral-bent ribs pierced his intestines. The leg bones that had been thrown out had suffered comminuted fractures, transverse fractures, and variously shattered segmental fractures. As a result, there was no bone, muscle, blood, skin, or anything else. At least he's alive. Vikir breathed a sigh of relief. He had the protection of the river Styx and the power of Beelzebub's stiff-necked breath to thank for his survival. The consequences of misjudging Madame Eight-Legged's fighting prowess were painful, but he was glad to be off Hugo's radar for now. His death will be reported to Baskerville soon. There were plenty of eyewitnesses to his death, including Adolphe the Mad, a camel, a Staffordshire, and triplets, so I needn't worry about proving it. Furthermore, he did not die for not knowing his fractions, but rather for saving the next head of Morgue from demons and barbarians. The Baskervilles will benefit greatly from future diplomacy with Morgue. Moreover, the Baskervilles are a knightly family, and this tale will contribute greatly to their image both internally and externally. Such a feat would likely be rewarded by the imperial court. Even in death, he would not be treated as a pathetic bastard for bringing honor and profit to the clan. If you return to your family in the future and reveal that you're alive, you'll be treated even better. I must recover quickly and regain my former strength. Vikir used the power of Murcielago to heal the wounds on his body. Bones and wounds that were healing at a ridiculous rate, though not immediately. Then, Vikir suddenly noticed the ropes around his neck. A noose hung like a collar around Vikir's neck. This was the other thing that had saved Vikir's life, besides the protection of the river Styx and the power of Murcielago. If it hadn't been for the noose, which flew up from behind and yanked at his throat just before the creature's attack crushed his entire body, Vikir would have died. It was a very well-timed snare that nearly broke his neck and killed him, but he's glad to be alive. Vikir clutched at the noose around his neck. The end of the noose's rope ran through the tent and out the door. Vikir lifted his head and looked back inside the tent. A cone-shaped tent made of animal skins. A few wooden supports were the only poles, and the floor was littered with dried leaves. Rustle. A glass vial of some sort was lying in a circle beside him, and upon closer inspection, he realized it was a potion bottle with the sigil of the Baskervilles. The smell of dry earth, fallen leaves, animal fur, and stewing potions mingled in the tent. Vikir crawled like a dog out of the tent. Her whole body burned with each step, but she needed to get a sense of her surroundings. Soon, the landscape outside the tent came into view. Large and small tents made of leather, drums beating everywhere, flames leaping from high piles of wood. A large number of barbarians moved among them. Black or silver hair, brown skin, and well-toned muscles in both men and women. Tops made of deer or jaguar skins, bottoms of cloth dyed with acorn juice. Tattooed and scarred, they dismembered the carcass of a demon and skinned its flesh, while children played with birds. The atmosphere was cheerful and lively, but raw, unrefined and unprocessed. Vikir knew instinctively that this was the home of the Balak, a barbarian tribe. In the heart of enemy territory, longtime enemies of the Baskervilles. He should be on his guard, but he was too weak to do so now. Vikir wondered what to do next. Balak's warriors walked past him, paying him no mind as he stood there alone. The women and children stiffened a little and seemed wary, but that was it. Just then, quick, 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 walk. A nervous shout came from somewhere. Vikir turned his head to see several barbarian warriors dragging rope-bound prisoners. The prisoners, standing in a line and staggering, were of various races. Most were black-haired, brown-skinned men of other tribes. Every single one of them had been tortured and abused in some way. Vikir recognized a few familiar faces among them. Warriors whose names he did not recognize, but who were surely members of House Baskerville and House Morgue. Some he'd met in the fortress, others he'd traveled with to this jungle. Their entire bodies hung like fish from ropes, their eyes locked for the briefest of moments with Vikir, who wore only a single dog collar around his neck. Quote. And then they walked past each other. Vikir stood silent, watching them. Then the Balak warriors stabbed their captives with the tips of their spears. Climb up quickly, unless you want to be mauled to death by wolves. They led their captives to a tall tree. It was an impossibly tall pole, covered in thorns that jutted out like blades. Balak's barbarians forced their captives to climb this bladed tree with their bare bodies. The captives climb this tower of blades until they are covered in blood. If anyone refused to climb, the barbarians would set fire to the base of the tree. The tree was oiled on the trunk, so the flames continued to climb up the tree, faster than most prisoners could climb a tree. Eventually, the prisoners would either bleed to death from being stabbed and cut by the blade-like trunks, burned by the flames from below, or plummet to their deaths on the ground below. Thump, thump, thump. Below the tree, the wolves were howling, pushing their captives up the tree. Some had been impaled by spears or bitten by wolves for refusing to climb the Tree of Blades. The horrific, Tree of Thorns punishment, was devised by an old Balak shaman. Vikir could only watch this hellish execution. Then, hoo, be thankful you don't look like that. Someone says to Vikir, Hun. It was the barbarian warrior who had shot the camel with the tranquilizer needle the other day. He was giving Vikir a murderous glare, as if he wanted to kill him right now. If you weren't the captain's pet, I would have boiled you right there. Quote. Don't just stand there, go find your master. Hun kicked Vikir hard on the butt with his foot. Quote. Vikir fell to the ground and stared at Hun. Hun flinched slightly at the stare. What kind of eyes? There was not an ounce of agitation in those serene eyes. Not the horrific deaths of his captives, not the pain of his battered body. Hun felt a shiver run down his spine as he realized that none of it had stirred Vikir's soul. Slowly, Vikir rose from his seat and began to follow the rope around his neck. Hun could only follow behind, unable to keep up with Vikir. The guy from earlier. You said his name was Hun, didn't you? He probably holds a grudge because he hurt his back falling off the wolf's back the other day. Vikir hadn't forgotten the face of the man who had just kicked his ass. But he couldn't do anything about it in his current state, so he'd just have to put up with it for now. Even now, the protection of the Styx River and the regenerative powers of Murcielago are slowly restoring Vikir's body to its former glory. In the meantime, Vikir has decided to visit the owner of the noose that saved his life. After walking for a while, tugging at the rope around his neck, Vikir finds himself in a remote area far from the village. A small spring fed a pool with a waterfall cascading down through the rocks. A few crayfish could be seen crawling in the clear water. A rope led to it. Vikir stopped walking for a moment. He's not sure what to do when he sees that the rope he's been following leads to the center of the pool and goes under the water. Just then, boom, there's a splash and a figure pokes its head out of the water. Water droplets splashing around, hair a mix of silver and black, pointed triangular ears. A girl with brown skin and big eyes walked out of the water. The end of the noose's rope was tied tightly around her wrists. Vikir looked straight into the barbarian girl's face. Dark, half-moon eyebrows, fox-like slant, eyes as clear as the puddle he was in now, red lips on an intelligent nose. The charcoal black color of his face was gone, but the look in his eyes was unmistakable. She was the barbarian girl I'd met at an illegal slave auction during the cleanup of Underdog City. They were diametrically opposed then. Vikir held her eyes steady. A brief silence followed. It was the barbarian girl who broke it first. She tugged at the leash around Vikir's neck and grinned. Get down. Chapter 53 Slave of the Barbarian Tribe 2. Ayan, a Balak warrior and the daughter of a chieftain. She spoke to Vikir in front of her. Get down. Was she trying to make the hierarchy clear? But it didn't sound like that was her intention. Because. PFF'd. Vikir felt a blast of air coming toward him. At the same time. Hot. Ian pulled on the leash around Vikir's neck. As Vikir ducked, a thin arrow flew past his back, hitting the ground with a thud. Ian shouted, "You boys, can't you go practice somewhere else?" Suddenly, a rustling sound came from beyond the bushes, and a group of young children came running. Each one had a bow and arrow in his hand. Quote. Vikir lifted his head again and looked at Ian in front of him. The girl shaking off the water in front of her. The girl he had rescued from the slave auction before. Ian said to Vikir, "We meet on the sphere, right?" He spoke in Baloch, judging his skills in the language to be better than Ian's in Imperial. Quote. "I see you again." Ian's eyes widened at the sound of the Baloch language coming out of Vikir's mouth. "Do you speak Baloch?" "A little." She walked to stand in front of Vikir, her eyes wide with wonder. She had only a few short pieces of deerskin around her, but she didn't seem to have any shame. Ian stepped up to stand in front of Vikir. "We were grateful then. We will repay your favor twice and your vengeance tenfold." Quote. "You saved me once, so I will save you twice." Quote. "I never thought you'd try to fight her. I ran away and came back just in case." Certainly, Vikir would have been killed by Madame Eight-Legged, the Dark One, if the rope Ian had thrown hadn't been caught around his neck in time to pull him back. "So what is the other time?" When Vikir looked at him as if demanding an explanation, the corners of Ian's eyes drew a fox-like arc. "Did you not see it on the way here?" She pointed beyond the bushes to the acrid column of smoke rising from the village. Vikir thought of the prisoners he'd met along the way. Perhaps she would share a similar fate. Perhaps it was the Ian in front of him who had prevented it. If so, that raised a more fundamental question. Why did you save me? Was it simply to repay a favor? If so, there would be no reason for her to throw the noose around his neck in the first place. And Ian was not the only one who wanted to put a noose around Vikir's neck. Every female warrior in Baloch that day had her sights set on Vikir's neck. Vikir asked her bluntly, "Is this some kind of husband hunt or something?" "Oh, you must have heard about it somewhere. It's not just the Baloch, most savages in the jungle kidnap their spouses from outside the tribe. The idea is to avoid incest and bring in fresh blood. The Baloch, of course, are a warrior tribe, so the physical strength of the abductee is a big factor." Ian circled around Vikir once, like an appraiser evaluating a piece of merchandise. In the meantime, Vikir had been thinking a lot. What if they told the Baskervilles that they were alive, and they negotiated a hostage? That would put a damper on their plans. Their plan to stay off Hugo's radar and build up their strength would be ruined. In order to stop it, you have to escape this place or annihilate all of them. That was impossible with Vikir's current physical condition. But Vikir had worried for nothing. They didn't seem to have any intention of interfering with him. Ian glanced at Vikir and said, "Don't be mistaken. I am not like the other women. I don't need a husband." Quote. "You have been captured to be used as a slave." She wondered, but didn't say it out loud, if it had been necessary to throw the noose so desperately. When Vikir remained still, Ian waved the dog collar in his hand. "You won't be able to pass for a man with that body anyway, so you might as well get used to life as a slave." By nature, Baloch women see nothing but breeding in the men they capture from the outside world. If the man fails to fulfill his role as a male, they usually kill him, but fortunately, Ian doesn't seem to have the sense to do so. Ian tossed his clothes to Vikir at the water's edge. Vikir catches it, and the collar pulls taut. Ian led the way back to the village. "You will live in front of my house and serve me." Vikir's entire body screamed with each step, but he kept his mouth shut nonetheless. The good news is that his body is recovering quickly, thanks to the power of Murcielago. To Vikir, Ian gave his first order, briefly. "Let's get our formalities straightened out." Walking ahead, Ian paused at the entrance to the clan and looked back at Vikir. She looked down and narrowed her eyes. "Call me master." Vikir descended again into the village of the Baloch. They lived freely in the dense jungle. The concept of personal property seemed remote. If you didn't have a place to sleep, you slept in a neighbor's tent, and no one minded. If they were hungry, they ate from people who had plenty of food, and they were happy to share. There seemed to be a shared consciousness that everything comes and goes, so let's share while we have it. They gathered at a friend's house with a large tent, played cheerfully, and fell asleep. Firewood, meat, and alcohol were shared generously. Even if they had been kidnapped from the outside, once they were recognized as members of the tribe, they could go anywhere and come anywhere. Overall, a lively and welcoming atmosphere. But the skeletons of captives hanging from the thorn trees at the tribe's boundary conveyed a different message. This is Balak's clan, a land that is unforgiving to outsiders but endlessly friendly and free to residents. But within the clan, there is a dignified zone, where even insiders are not allowed to roam. Vikir's destination was one of those few places. A large tent in the center of the village. It looked like it could hold up to 24 people, but even the children playing in front of it were not allowed to approach. Passing warriors always bowed their heads in reverence toward the entrance of this tent. Those grilling meat were careful to keep the smoke from wafting in this direction, and those preparing the entrails of their prey were careful to keep the scent of blood from drifting away. Is this the chieftain's house? Vikir guessed from the size of the tent. Ian grabbed the leash around Vikir's neck and strode inside. Mother. Vikir could see the figure Ian sought. Inside the tent, there was a chair with a large eagle carved into it, and a woman sitting cross-legged, reclining at an angle. A grim expression, scars ovipositing all over her body. She wears a cloak and bottoms made of eagle feathers, and a long, large bow rests on a scepter behind her back. She wore a cloak of eagle feathers, with a long, large bow on her back. Aquila, the current matriarch of the Balak. Vikir knelt silently before her, drawn by Ian's touch. Vikir had already realized that the chieftainess' real name was Night Fox, as she exuded a heavy presence before him. The woman who had scarred the bridge of Heavenly Sword Saint Hugo's nose. Even Adolf the Mad had been defeated by her, and had spent some time in the service. Her presence was the reason why Baskerville and the Morgue were unable to cross the border between the enemy and the Black Mountain. After all, she had killed 16 Gradient-class swordsmen, 10 4th-class mages, and 6 5th-class mages in her short life, all without a single wound. She was also the one who had left arrowhead marks on the faces of her enemies and the Black Mountain demon Cerberus. What if it was before the regression? If I had been able to unleash the power of my prime, could I have faced this woman? I would have had a 0% chance in a hand-to-hand fight, a 0% chance by assassination, and a 20% chance by running away. That 20%, of course, is the chance of survival. Vikir's mind raced as he tried to gauge the woman in front of him. After all, she was up against a Hugo or an Adolf, a top predator that she was no match for right now. Meanwhile, Aquila glared down at Vikir in front of her. Daughter, is this the imperial male you've been drooling over? No, when did I ever say that much, but yes, he is. He's younger than you, and I recognize his face. Aquila stared at Vikir with narrowed eyes. The gaze was like that of a top predator from a vastly elevated position, scanning the lesser prey below. All Vikir could do was keep his head down and avoid her gaze as much as possible. Fortunately, Aquila didn't see any sign of Hugo on Vikir. Hugo had strong lines, a square jaw, and a masculine appearance, while Vikir took on more of his mother's features. Apart from that though, Aquila seemed to have a pretty good idea of Vikir's physical condition. I see. What are you doing picking up a wasted man? If you treat him well, he'll be worth it. He's the one who jumped on Madame Eightlegs. HMPH. Yes, but rampaging without knowing your place will only get you in trouble. Aquila said. Sure. It doesn't matter if the body is broken or not, as long as the seeds are intact. Ah, mother, that's not it, he's going to be used as a slave. What? But isn't that the purpose you've been telling me all along? Whoa, that's what it was originally intended for, a slave. I need one to help me hunt. Ian quickly waved her hand to stop Aquila's words. Aquila looked at her daughter with a puzzled expression, then nodded. Well, so be it. It is your freedom to use your slave for whatever purpose you choose. As soon as the words were out of her mouth, Ian bowed her head and tugged on Vikir's leash. Once outside the tent, Ayan's expression was much stiffer than before. The flustered look on her face before her mother was gone. From now on, I will give you a mission. Ayan looked down at Vikir, who was only one head shorter than her, and spoke in a high-pitched voice. It will be difficult. A pretty tough mission, indeed. Chapter 54 Slaves of the Barbarian Tribe 3. Ayan is the youngest hunting leader of the Balak. She leads the young men of Balak through the jungle without fear. However, she has met a foe that has surprised her. His name is Vikir, a slave who was recently captured in a raid on imperial territory. Ayan stared at Vikir with a blank expression. Vikir moved swiftly with his uncomfortable body, building a tent for himself, as if he didn't need anyone's help. A dozen wooden sticks, each just over 2 meters long, are lined up in a row, and a mixture of inky black, stone dust, lime powder, and water is applied to the sides. The structure was a mixture of dry and wet, the walls lined with leaves and covered with animal skins. The tents were quickly fitted with doors and windows, and the floors were lined with sawdust and fallen leaves. The few building materials given to the slaves were enough. In less than half an hour, the tent was ready for Vikir to sleep in alone. Order fulfilled. Vikir looked back at Ayan, his voice hard and dry. The first order Ayan had given to Vikir was to make him a home of his own. Ayan peered into Vikir's tent in disbelief. There was a small hole in the ceiling and a flap that could be closed if it rained. There was even a small fire pit on the floor inside, and a hole for the smoke to escape extended outward across the floor of the tent. When the fire was turned off for a meal, the smoke would pass under the floor and heat up to the bottom of the tent. The smoke would escape, the heat from the residual fire would be trapped, and the ventilation and light would be perfect. Ayan was dumbfounded. How do you build tents so well? She was actually looking forward to hearing Vikir grunt in protest. Ayan quickly hid the building materials that Vikir had been trying to give away to make his life more colorful. Sturdy wooden sticks, oil for baking bricks. But Vikir didn't need any of that. He found calcareous soil, scooped it up, and hardened it with water. He also built a shelter of large leaves to protect against rain and wind. It's been a while. Swordsmen from the Age of Destruction were not just good with swords. They had to be skilled in all sorts of survival skills to be able to camp and survive in the hot and cold polar regions. As such, Vikir was also a master of many domestic tasks. After building the tent, Vikir trimmed the piles of leather near Ayan's tent and hung up the torn fabrics. He also cleared a drainage ditch near the tent, and laid out some firewood for tonight. A slave who thinks and acts on his own before his master asks him to do anything, and takes care of all those pesky chores. Literally a Class A slave. The bricks under the chieftain's tent look unstable. My mother's house. Yes. The way it is, the ground beneath the center pole of the tent could shake and leak water during the next rainy season. If you give me the order, I will mix the limestone soil down there with stone dust from the hill across the street, make bricks, oil them, bake them, and reinforce them. Yes, do that. I was just thinking of that myself. Ayan scratched her head. Vikir had indeed done so. Moving on his limp legs, he scooped up white dirt from the hills behind him and flew in stones from the hill opposite, cracking and breaking them to mix into the soil. Then he added water to make a dough, shaped it into a rectangle, baked it over a fire, and dried the bricks with hyena oil. The bricks were then used to form the base of the tent, making it even stronger. Even Aquila, who was initially annoyed at the extra work, was pleased with the results. The ceiling won't leak anymore. It was annoying that no matter how many leaves or hides I put on the ceiling, it would still leak, but it must have been the foundation. Aquila still didn't pay much attention to Vikir. He merely ordered him to make his usual rounds around the chieftain's barracks, observing, maintaining, and repairing the shabby things. Ayan was unhappy that his slave should spend most of his time maintaining the chieftain's barracks, but he didn't protest. He just kept whimpering behind him as Vikir dug drainage ditches around Aquila's barracks and set up gutters to keep leaves and dirt from piling up on top. Hey, man, are you okay working alone? I'd say, and then do some nervous shuffling. So, are we gonna do it alone or in a group? which is usually followed by a few unintelligible words. Do you enjoy your job? You've been working all day. It's the rainy season, you're already digging gutters. You don't have this at home, do you? Eat it. The owner is talking to you, why don't you answer him? Vikir had been steadily ignoring him as a distraction from his work, but Ian continued to hover around him, disappearing for a moment and then reappearing. At this point, it was hard to tell who was master and who was slave. Huck, 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 thud. With lie and a bat, Vikir finished his laundry. He'd been a pathfinder, a herbalist, a healer, a cook, an assassin, a cleaner, a laundress, a cook, and everything in between, from the youngest crawler in the field to a seasoned veteran, and his experience was coming in handy here. I know I keep using the Age of Destruction excuse, but it was just as fierce. Vikir took a moment to reminisce about the old days while doing laundry. KH. Beside him, Ian, who had stepped forward to give a demonstration, hid her torn leather skirt behind her back as she watched. Meanwhile, Vikir, whose experience of surviving the Age of Destruction has made him good at keeping to himself. But even he, who was quite content with a day in the life of a slave, much more so than he would have been in Baskerville or Underdog City, had one opponent who might be a little embarrassed. Cool. Her name was Ian, princess of the barbarian tribe of Balak. She was peeing in the drainage channel Vikir had dug earlier. I've been holding it in for a long time. Master, are we supposed to watch you pee like that? Ian was peeing with her legs open, right next to where Vikir was working. Vikir was dumbfounded and asked, "What are you doing?" "Marking the territory. This is my slave's house, so it's also mine. It's not like there's any shame in open excretion. There is no such thing in my tribe." Ian lifted her skirt further, as if to show him. Vikir covered his face with her hands and turned away. He remembered seeing a research paper on barbarian tribes once. The barbarian tribes of the Red and Black Mountains practice free sexual intercourse among their members. Both men and women have no qualms about exposing their sexual organs to each other, as they must first know if the other person is capable of reproduction and does not carry a sexually transmitted disease before engaging in a relationship. Did I mention? It was a real thing and a culture with its own reasons, so Vikir tried not to be prejudiced. But don't be cheap, at least around the house. Why, didn't your empire just throw feces out the window a few hundred years ago, and you wore these things called high heels because the streets were covered in filth, and you sprayed yourself with perfume? It was true enough. Vikir didn't know what else to say, so he kept his mouth shut. As they chatted, the chores were completed. Balak was a very laid-back place when he wasn't fighting or hunting, and the ever-diligent Vikir couldn't help but think that life as a slave here was much more comfortable than it would have been in Baskerville or Underdog City, where he had to combine training and work. Ian, however, had a strange look on her face. "Hey, don't you want to officially become a member of our tribe as soon as possible?" What was she talking about? Vikir frowned, and Ian scooted closer to him and sat down. She was still spreading her legs wide enough that he could see through her skirt, so Vikir kept his gaze fixed upward. Ian said, "Not bad for a slave, huh? Not bad. You're getting a good education in speech, I suppose, though I dare not complain from a slave's point of view." No, it really isn't that bad. It can't be bad, for all the hard, dirty work. Ian waved her hand in the air, not even wanting to think about cleaning or doing laundry. "Come on, come with me. I will help you. To help you fit in with this tribe. There's no refusal when you're already enslaved." Ian patted the leash still around Vikir's neck. "If you're good, I'll take this off too. The offer is a bit tempting. As if I wasn't already annoyed by this irritating rope at the corner of my neck." What can I do? Vikir asks, and Ian answers with a twinkle in her eye. "Hunting. Hunt. The big one. Apparently, you go hunting and catch big prey. The Hagia, or Balak, are a tribe that accumulates food primarily through hunting. To feed their nearly 300 members evenly, they need to consume a boar weighing over 200 kilograms a day. That's if they're able to supplement it with mushrooms, berries, and edible roots. In recent years, he says, warriors in his tribe have been eating nothing but mushrooms and berries for days at a time because they haven't been able to find enough meat. In times like these, if we can bring back a large chunk of meat, your freedom is not out of the question. Ian's words gave Vikir a strange look. It was a bit ironic to hear the word, freedom, from a barbarian. But it wasn't a bad offer. All you have to do is assist me. Apparently you don't have much trouble getting around or carrying light loads. Ian said with a gleam in her eye. It was impossible to tell if her intentions were truly to take down the big game, or if that was all she wanted. All right, let's go. But Vikir decided to go along with Ian's suggestion for now. As a slave, he had no other choice. Vikir nodded, and Ian spoke immediately. We will leave at dawn today. I see, but why were you laughing so hard earlier? What? When did I laugh? Ian laughs self-consciously, but when she hears Vikir's words, she turns serious. Something about his attitude was a little suspicious. Chapter 55 The Hunter and the Hunted One. The Balak are a very warlike people by nature. It was clear that if you took war and hunting out of their lives, there probably wouldn't be much left. As Vikir followed Ian to the entrance of the clan, he reviewed what he knew about the Balak. Their language has only about 300 words, and most of them are nouns. Verbs are gestural, and there is no distinction between them and us when it comes to possession. Men are ambo, women are akwati, love is aauki, death is udika. The people of Balak viewed the empires as rude, devious, and pretentious. Conversely, the Imperials viewed the Balak as barbarians who screamed and punched at the slightest hint of anger. The people of Baskerville seemed to be somewhere in the middle, Vikir thought, between the civilized people of the Empire and the barbarians of the jungle. I wonder if they're vaguely resembling both sides of the border, never fully belonging to either. As Vikir pondered this to himself, the hunters of Balak gathered in a circle. Hunters, young and old, gathered in groups of 3 and 4. Several mounted on the backs of wolves, bows and spears dangling. Only Ian had no companions, just a wolf to ride and her slave, Vikir. Gather round, hunters, it's time for the ceremony. A crooked-looking old man came forward with a bowl of black charcoal, which he smeared on the faces of the hunter warriors. A series of tattoos peeked out from beneath his black robes, suggesting he might be a shaman. Go, all of you, with my blessing, or I will strike you down. The old shaman dipped a bowl of tan into the bowl and smeared it over the faces of all the hunters. The hunters of Balak feel guilty about killing their prey. So they smeared their faces with tar before killing, so as not to show their faces to the god of death. But the younger hunters, including Ian, don't seem to appreciate the ritual. There you go again, that annoying bitch. Leave him alone. The shaman needs to make his mark. By the way, don't you think your fortune-telling is a little off? That's why all they do nowadays are earrings for ears and nose rings for noses. All young people, regardless of time and place, dislike and despise old customs and superstitions. With a look of annoyance, Ian stuck out her face and accepted the old shaman's charcoal black makeup. The old shaman rubbed the black paint on Ian's face a few times before moving on, which was quite sloppy compared to what he did for the other warriors, and it was clear that he didn't like her. Next, Ian slipped the spiked collar around his neck and handed it to Vikir. Wear this to keep them from biting your neck. Vikir nodded. One by one, the hunters began to leave the village. Knives sheathed, spears drawn, bows drawn, wolves herded, the tribe's hunters departed. Vikir, the slave, made his own preparations. While I'm here, I'll have to blend in with them. He needed to renew his mindset. Vikir finally felt the urge and pulled down his pants to pee. He was going to start with something as basic as this and blend into the culture. So, when the people of Balak saw Vikir peeing, they began to freak out. The women covered their eyes and watched through their spread fingers, while the men gave him openly competitive glances. Vikir was puzzled and asked, "What's with all the stares? Isn't everyone doing this?" Answers came from all over the place. Quote, "What are you talking about? Who pisses in the middle of nowhere like that? Is that how they do it in the Empire? That's barbaric. We use separate restrooms. Men over there, women over here. You're so ignorant, you should cover up. How barbaric. What happened? Vikir turned his head to look at Ayan. Ayan smirked, then quickly averted her gaze. Ayan climbed onto the wolf's back. Hold on tight. On her back, of course, was Vikir. Vikir hesitated for a moment, unsure of where to hold on, then squeezed the wolf's fur. Then Ayan reached back and pulled Vikir's arm around her waist. You have to hold on here. Tight. If you don't, you'll fall and break your neck. Vikir grasped Ayan's thighs with his hands. It was certainly wide enough to be comfortable to hold. But the wolf took a single leap, and Vikir was sent tumbling to the ground. In agony, Vikir almost screamed. His bones, barely held together by Murcielago's regenerative powers, twisted again. Riding a wolf was quite different from riding a horse. For one thing, there was no saddle and no mount. Furthermore, wolves had a much narrower waist than horses, and they moved more dynamically. Ayan stopped the wolf and lowered himself to the ground. Tisk, tisk, you should have wrapped your arms around my waist like that and held on with both hands. It'll fall off if you hold it that gently. She smirked and patted her own waist, as if to say, how am I supposed to vent without you holding it? Vikir was just about to rise from his seat. Thud. A figure stepped in between Vikir and Ayan. A Hun. He was riding a wolf, looking down at Vikir. The atmosphere immediately turns chilly. Ayan crossed her arms in a look of displeasure. Balak's hunters compete for every moment. A Hun is a warrior who has always been fond of Ayan, and he will challenge her in this hunt. This time, he says, I'll bring home the bigger prey. I'm going to be the captain of the next joint hunt, in my grandfather's honor. Why would you risk your grandfather's honor on a hunt when all you know how to do is witchcraft? It's your prerogative to do whatever you want. Ayan didn't confront a Hun. He merely jerked his chin toward Vikir across the way, urging him to come quickly. Vikir had just gotten to his feet and was about to make his way toward Ayan. Huck! Vikir's head snapped back. A Hun, riding on top of the wolf, had kicked him in the face with his foot. Vikir was still wounded, so he had no choice but to take the blow even though he knew it was coming. Thank goodness it wasn't an attack of great force. The next moment, Ayan was furious. You bastard, what the? Ayan stepped forward, but she froze in place. She glanced back and forth between Vikir, who had fallen to the ground with a strange look in his eyes, and a Hun, who had gained momentum. A Hun flinched for a moment at Ayan's reaction, then breathed a sigh of relief. Then he looked at the fallen Vikir and sneered. You're using this weakling as a hunting aid. Get a grip, Captain. You'll only get yourself in trouble. You should look at your own backside before you say that. At Ayan's sarcastic remark, a Hun looked down at his waist. There was nothing there, where there should have been a quiver full of arrows. Exclamation mark question mark quote. A Hun whipped his head around, furious. Vikir had somehow gotten up with his quiver and arrows. He had just swiped it from a Hun before he collapsed. The age of destruction again. Before his regression, Vikir hadn't really had a job he hadn't done. The art of pickpocketing comes in handy, too. Weapons are like lovers. You use them when they're taken away. Vikir's grave comment made Ayan burst out laughing and a Hun blush. You insolent slave. A Hun drew his bowstring and struck Vikir in the shoulder. Boom. With a loud crack, Vikir fell to the ground. As if that wasn't enough, a Hun climbed off the wolf's back. Boom. The bowstring swung out once more. Boom. A Hun's bow had to stop in midair. Ayan had drawn an arrow. And blocked a Hun's bowstring. That's enough. Whose slave do you think you're punishing? Ayan's words were as cold and hard as frost. Hun stammered out a retort. He's a slave, how dare he insult a Balak warrior? You showed your pathetic self first. Nevertheless, he's a slave, and a slave can never insult a warrior. A Hun protested, citing the rules of the tribe. Quote. Ayan thought for a moment, then nodded. Very well, a slave is a slave, and if he does something wrong, he must be punished. Yes, Captain, that's what I'm saying, but you have no right to punish him, he's my slave. Quote. Question mark quote. The concept of private property is rare on Balak, but when it comes to slaves, the lines of ownership are pretty strict. When a Hun shook his head, Ayan drove a wedge. If there is to be a punishment, it will be mine. With that, Ian slid off the wolf's back and stood in front of Vikir. And then, snap! Ian's hand slapped Vikir across the cheek. As Vikir fell to the ground, Ian continued to beat him. Her fists curled like snakes, targeting his abdomen, waist, and legs. Vikir curled into a circle and endured Ian's fists in silence. After a few minutes of this, Ian pulled back, breathing heavily. Then she glared at Ahun with a cold stare. Are we done? Quote. Ahun held his breath, as if he was embarrassed by Ian's spanking, and then nodded in disbelief. Ian looked Ahun straight in the eyes. I know you have a lot of personal grievances with my slave, falling off the wolf's back, not being able to catch Saxi. Quote. Yes. After this time, if you do anything to my slave in private, you will be beaten like this. Do you understand? Ian's fist dripped with blood. Her eyes were dark and flesh-colored. Ahun nodded his head a few times in confusion, then turned his bored gaze to Vikir on the floor. Vikir, who hadn't screamed up until that point, was simply writhing quietly in place. With that, Ahun climbed onto the wolf's back and quickly disappeared. Only Ian and Vikir were left here again. Sigh. Ian creeped over and squatted down in front of Vikir. Vikir pushed himself to his feet. She stroked Vikir's reddened cheeks with an unfathomable, complicated gaze. Quote. Were you hurt? His tone had changed slightly, but maybe it was just his mood. Chapter 56 The Hunter and the Hunted 2. Quote. Vikir was speechless on the wolf's back. Ian, riding in front of him, glanced up and down the length of his back, watching him closely. Did it hurt? Quote. Are you angry? Quote. Ian turns her head all the way back to look at Vikir. To which Vikir only replies bluntly, look ahead. The wolf Ian was riding caught on a root and lurched once. Ian quickly jerked her head back to the front and drove the wolf on. All the while, she kept glancing back to see if Vikir was bothering her. At this point, it was hard to tell who was master and who was slave. Eventually, as the roots disappeared and a wide-open plain emerged, Ian slowed the wolf. She turned back to Vikir, still on the wolf's back, and spoke. I had no choice. Ahun is a stubborn, relentless creature, and this was the only way to prevent his petty retribution. Quote. Why aren't you talking, huh? At his master's continued prodding, Vikir replied shortly. It hurts. And it did. The inside of his mouth is covered in crusts of blood, and it hurts just to open it. Then, Ian's body flinched for a moment. She slowly turned her head to look at Vikir. Does it hurt a lot? Ian looked at Vikir's neck. The white skin was smeared with red marks from the dog collar. Quote. Ian stared at the mark for a moment. Then she bent her head toward Vikir and ran her tongue across the scar on his neck. Vikir jerked his head back in disgust, and Ian, for a moment, realizing what she had done, backed away in anger. Vikir frowned. Do barbarians normally lick each other's wounds? Animals of the dog family do. Balak's warriors are friendly with wolves, so this behavior may be commonplace. But Vikir was a civilized man, and it was awkward. Besides, licking the wound with your tongue is dangerous, as it leaves room for infection. So Vikir was prepared to firmly refuse if Ian tried to lick the wound on his neck again. However, quote. Ian doesn't say anything, just tilts her head. For some reason, the tips of his pointed ears were colored bright red. Like all Balak warriors, Ian was basically a simple person. Her spirits were quickly lifted when Vikir returned to his usual behavior, except that he was less talkative due to his illness. Now in a better mood, Ian offered Vikir a gift to apologize for her earlier slap. Is there anything you want from me, anything I can do for you that's within my power, just tell me one thing. Vikir didn't hesitate to answer. Teach me how to shoot a bow. A bow. I wondered if she had something else on his mind. The answer came back a little muffled. Ian looked a little disappointed at Vikir's immediate response. Yeah, bow is good. Bow. Ian mumbled for a moment, then a grim smile curved her lips. Good. Since we're out hunting, I'll teach you how to shoot a bow, too. You're probably better with a bow than a sword anyway. With that, Ian moved behind Vikir and hugged him tightly against his chest. Ian's body pressed tightly against his, the weight of it pressing down on Vikir's spine. Vikir grunted through the pain. Do I really have to learn in this position? It's best to learn everything with your body. Do you have a problem with that? It was hard for Vikir, whose body was broken, to resist. Then, Ian pulled out a spare bow and placed it in Vikir's hand. The unfamiliar feel of it in his hand brought back memories for a moment. Vikir was quite proficient with a bow, as part of the education of the young hounds of Iron-Blooded Baskerville was an introduction to armory. And the swordsmen of the Age of Destruction actually knew how to use almost every other weapon to some degree, not just swords. Vikir had already mastered the basics of archery. A minor, really, but not enough to go out and show off. Before his regression, he'd been pretty good with a bow, but not to the point where he could actually use it in combat. At best, he could take down small prey that could be cleaned and eaten immediately. But here in Balak, where all the people are masters of the art of archery, he might be able to reach new heights. Is it the desire to take down the big prey? Ian had been teaching Vikir archery since the beginning of the day. We'll need the help of a wolf pup for this hunt. Ian was eager for this hunt. Balak's 300 members need at least 200 kilograms of meat to survive the day. What's more, the warrior's recent hunting performance has been poor, and there are many people in the tribe who are starving. Your life will be easier if you make your mark here. At Ian's words, Vikir nodded. Just then, Ian's wolf, Vakira, suddenly stopped running. It had spotted its prey. Ian bent down and grabbed a handful of dirt from where Vakira was sniffing. A mixture of rotting sawdust and fallen leaves, moss and sand. The soil was slightly damp, and it smelled sharp and raw. Ian said with conviction, "It must be an oxbear." Vikir knew the creature Ian spoke of. Less than oxbear, greater than. Danger rating, A. Size, 5 meters. Found in Ridge 7, Red and Black Mountains. A very large bear with 2 huge horns. A carnivorous bear, the strongest terrestrial predator, and a perfect killing machine, it is considered the strongest and pinnacle of the Red and Black Mountains 7th Ridge ecosystem. It has few natural enemies, except for its own kind. The bear carries 2 water buffalo horns on its head. Its entire body is covered in thick muscle, fat, and bristly fur. A monster I had encountered many times before during my training within the clan. However, the ones roaming around here now must possess a different level of strength and life force than the ones that were captured in the cages inside the clan, waiting to be killed. This must be their territory from here on out. Ian turned his head to follow the direction of the scent. Oxbears deliberately sprayed their poisonous urine to discourage prey and warn rivals. The scent would have sent any lesser predator running for cover, but not Ian, the hunting leader of the younger Balak. Vikir, too, had the calm composure of the worn and tattered hound he had been before his regression. Ian smirked at the sight. Not scared. Not really. It's good to see you've got some balls for a kid from the Empire. An oxbear is a threat to even the most experienced hunters of the Balak. Ian seemed to like Vikir's demeanor all the more. Soon, Ian and Vikir were facing the wind, tracking the scent. Ian pursued his prey with animal instincts. Sometimes he could smell it better than Vakira, the wolf. Vikir, too, was skilled at tracking, but only when it came to fleeing humans. Good chance. Vikir looked over his shoulder at Ian's skilled monster tracking. And then, it wasn't long before they spotted their target at the top of a rolling hillside lined with tall bushes and short shrubs. I see a large oxbear making its way through the brush. 2 fiercely curved horns, fur far thicker and denser than I'd ever known, flesh and muscle clinging together in an impossibly tight knot. The oxbear, which appeared to be very old, stood about 8 meters tall, larger than any oxbear Vikir had seen before his regression. That's enough to raise my risk rating. When Vikir muttered that, he was done talking. It's hard to go head to head with a creature of that size. It would have been better to back off now and move on to other prey. But Ian didn't back down. Let's go after it. She clung to Vikir's side. Vikir gritted his teeth against a faint ache. A beast of that size will be hard to beat. Apparently he's unusually strong for an oxbear. Fool. Who said we'd catch him? Vikir looked puzzled at Ayan's comment. She replied with a smirk. If there's a female bear, there's no shortage of male bears. Look. Before she could finish, a response came from beyond the thicket. Another oxbear had approached the previous oxbear. Apparently, the giant oxbear that Vikir and Ayan had first spotted was a female. The new male oxbear was relatively small. It was barely over 4 meters tall at best, and must have weighed nearly twice as much. Could she be in heat? As the female oxbear moves her massive body, the male oxbear sneaks up on her and sniffs her fur. Then he starts nuzzling her chest and back. Okay, that's the real prey. Ayan grinned and pressed Vikir's chest and back against the bush. Vikir watched the grooming of the male and female ox bears and felt the strength of Ayan's grip on his arms. Hidden in the bushes, Ayan's body pressed closer to Vikir's. Her breath, wet and hot, brushed against his earlobe. The skin of every inch of her body, toned and soft, pressed against Vikir's back. The pounding of her heart against his back made him tense up like an athlete. Naturally, Vikir could only think one thought. That's a lot of weight. Chapter 57 The Hunter and the Hunted 3. When there are sows, there are no shortage of bulls. Vikir understood now why Ayan had said this. Vikir and Ayan are currently lurking in front of a den deep in the jungle. The den they are watching closely contains a large female oxbear and a small male oxbear. The two ox bears have been mating non-stop for 3 days. The female's strength and desire were immense. She blocked the entrance to the nest and pushed down on the exhausted male to prevent him from escaping. He, too, had good seeds and was able to satisfy her intense thirst for a couple of days, but by the 3rd day he was running out of strength and often made dying noises. Females are the strongest of their kind, and their appetites are unusually voracious. She had a long hibernation ahead of her, so she didn't let go of him for a moment to make sure she was going to get pregnant and hibernate. When he gives it all out and spreads out, she climbs on top of him, grooms him all over, and brings him back to his feet. And then she'd do it all over again, over and over again. Vikir sighed softly. I don't know what I'm doing. Vikir's arms are filled with the carp, salmon, berries, mushrooms, and other things he's just caught. Ayan, too, had gathered up various supplies and laid them out in front of the cave. These were not for Vikir and Ayan to eat. They were for the ox bears mating in that den. They had been helping the ox bears mate for the past 3 days. When a hungry female came out to forage for food, Ayan and Vikir would provide her with these small bits of food so that she could mate as quickly and as often as possible. The female oxbear would carefully examine them for poison, then take them back to the male and feed him to restore his strength. Ayan smiled wryly. Those berries and mushrooms are a short-term boost. But in the long run, they're terrible for you. They raise the body's heat rapidly and then drop it rapidly again. Vikir knew the benefits of those ingredients. Taking them makes you temporarily stronger, but it saps and burns your life force, which is not good for your health. And the female oxbear seemed to know this and still took them. The male oxbear also seems to recognize the benefits of these mushrooms and berries, but he can't do much to satisfy her needs right now. He can only eat. Sometimes during the feeding, if Vikir accidentally left a scent or a trail, the female oxbear would come out of her den, alert and wary. She was old and had poor eyesight, but her ears seemed to make up for it. She tore at the thick logs around her with her claws and pulled rocks apart. A giant tree that must have been hundreds of years old was snapped in half, and the rocks that supported the small hill were shattered. After ravaging the area for a while, the female, satisfied that there were no more signs of intruders around her, went back into the den and climbed on the exhausted male. Vikir, hiding behind a bush, muttered quietly, I don't know if it's a warning to the intruder or the male. Such a display of strength would scare off the intruder, but it would also make it impossible for a cowardly male to escape. Vikir now understood why Ayan had chosen a large, powerful female to pursue first. The stronger and larger the female, the more likely she was to be able to keep the male at a distance. Meanwhile, lurking hunters need to eat, too. Ayan calculated the direction of the wind and set about making a meal that would not carry the scent to the ox bears. Seafood stew that she was cooking in a coconut shell with crayfish from the waterfall. The only other additions were a handful of salt and a bunch of dried seaweed. Ian offered Vikir some of her stew. She pushed all, the crayfish, even the plump ones, in front of Vikir. It was a sight that made it hard to tell who was the master and who was the slave. Eat a lot, so you can feel better. Ian shoved a considerable amount of food in front of Vikir's nose. Vikir thought she looked a bit like a camel. The red crayfish's body snaps in half. The hard shell cracked open, revealing plump white flesh. The yellow and blue guts were steaming hot. Vikir chewed on the crayfish's head. By the way, they mate like crazy. For 3 days, the ox bears barely left their burrows. The constant vibrations of the burrow and the mingled moans of the males and females inside must have been exhausting for those who had been watching for 3 days. Ian's eyes light up with mischief at Vikir. Isn't that what you deserve? What? I thought all Balak men were supposed to do that, but not Imperial men. Vikir frowned. Ian's words were so unreliable after what had happened. Hadn't he once taken her word for it and pissed in the middle of nowhere and been humiliated by his tribe? But Ian continues to tease Vikir. You can't do that. Quote. Well, maybe you can't because you come from the land of the Sandman. Who's a Sandman? Then can you do that? Quote. Can you do it? Can you do it? Ian was getting annoying. Vikir knew that getting caught up in her pace would be a headache, so he chose to ignore her completely. What a cheeky slave. Just then, a cry unlike any other erupted. Quote. Exclamation mark quote. The playfulness drained from Ian's face. She bounced to her feet, quickly grabbed her bow and arrow, and began to peer over the bush. The playful 17-year-old girl of just moments ago was nowhere to be seen. Only the sharp-shooting hunter remained. Ian's wolf had bared her teeth as well. Vikir, too, dropped his food and rose to his feet, crouching beside Ian. A commotion was from the den containing the 2 ox bears. The female, who had been gentle with the male up until this point, gagged a few times and suddenly changed her demeanor. She bared her teeth at him and threatened him with her hidden nails. The male was taken aback by her sudden change in demeanor, but remained lying on the ground, apparently trusting his bond with her. He seems to want to stay in his big, cozy nest for a while longer. But she wasn't about to let him keep squirming and pressing against her. Bam! A dull noise. The female slammed her front paw with the force of several tons. Teeth snapped and blood spurted. A slap on the ear jolted the male to his feet. He scrambled out of the den on shaky legs. Ian called out in triumph. Looks like the female is convinced that she's fertile. Now that she's successfully conceived, she doesn't need to squeeze the male's seeds. It's a world of carnivorous bears. After mating, the opposite sex is simply a competing predator that has invaded their territory. The female roared once more at the fleeing male. The male is confused and scrambling for his life. The male scurries away from the female's lair in a daze. To avoid being eaten, he had to run away as fast as he could while she wasn't in a bad mood. His legs are shaking and his movements are slurred and slippery. Her fur was matted and had lost much of its shine. His nose and eyes were dry, and all the fat that had once been plump on his back, belly, flanks, and thighs had been burned away. His cheeks were already visibly puffy from the slap he had just received. And at the sight of such a male oxbear, the eyes of Ian, the hunter of the Balak, glittered. Follow me, slave. Quote. Ian, a male oxbearer, and Vikir, a slave to his mistress. This was the beginning of the real hunt. Chapter 58 The Hunter and the Hunted For. Ian and Vikir tracked the oxbear male with caution. It was obvious that his nerves were as sharp as his body was weakened. This was evident by the water scattered in his path. You have to take advantage of the moment when your target is as weak as possible. Vikir nodded as Ian applied frog venom to her arrowhead. When is the enemy most fragile? It's when they're sleeping, especially after several vigorous copulations. Ian looked at the oxbear feces on the floor and nodded. Judging by the viscosity and consistency, he's in very bad shape. He'll probably sleep soundly tonight. Of course he will, he hasn't slept a wink for the past 3 days and is drained of energy. He'll probably retreat to a dark, deep corner where he doesn't normally go. Ian was right. The oxbear was aware of its condition, and it was heading deeper and deeper into the dense floodwaters. Dense jungle. Fallen trees hung between the living, creating a maze of trees. The leaves were turning red and yellow, making it difficult to discern direction. Tracking the animals was made even more difficult by the fact that their tracks could be washed away in as little as half a day if it rained. But Ian never loses sight of her target. The way the branches bend, the way the grass is trampled, the depth of the soil, the chirping of the grasshoppers around him. To a seasoned hunter, these are all signposts. Where an oxbear has passed, you won't hear a mouse or insect for a while. As if in agreement, the wolf Bakura lets out a low howl. Bakura had been tracking a scent from earlier, the faint scent of sweet-smelling berries, a faint scent that the human nose could not detect. The scented berries had been stuffed into the stomachs of carp and salmon by the Iron and tossed to Oxbear as food. So that Oxbear would breathe it in and carry it with him everywhere he went. Quote. Meanwhile, Vikir had watched the Iron's skillful tracking from start to finish. Some parts he didn't know, some parts he did. What he knew, he would review, what he didn't know, he would learn. Then, up in the trees, Ian looked down at the forest at the bottom of the hill and stretched out a finger. Sure enough, there it was, a male oxbear stumbling along. He could probably catch it if he pounced on it right now, but he was cautious nonetheless. Well, we'll have to put off the hunt for a while. Why is that? Vikir asked, and Ian grunted and frowned. That oxbear has crossed the borders of the swamp. There are scary creatures that live in the swamp, so we can't go in there. Scary creatures. Vikir was about to ask what it was. Ian's two palms flew out and slapped Vikir on both cheeks. The cheeks flushed red in an instant. As Vikir stood there dazed, Ian smirked. This is the creature. Ian held out one palm in front of Vikir. In the center of his palm was a dead mosquito. Bakura growled lowly and pawed at the mosquito's corpse in warning. Ian warned with a serious expression. There are 3 types of mosquitoes in that swamp. One is the blood-sucking mosquito. These are not very threatening. But, bone-sucking mosquitoes and flesh-sucking mosquitoes, you have to be careful. This was something Vikir knew as well. Of all the mosquitoes in the waters of the Red and Black Mountains, the bone-suckers were the most dangerous. They swarm over anything that moves, turning the body of a living creature into a leather bag of blood and guts in an instant. In fact, Vikir had seen what the bone-sucking mosquitoes had done to a colleague a few times before, so he understood the gravity of Ian's situation. But there's one thing he doesn't understand. But, why won't you take your hand away from my cheek? Ian's other hand was still on Vikir's cheek. Ian flinched slightly at Vikir's question, but then answered in a brusque manner. Do I have to take it off? Ian was now openly pinching the flesh of Vikir's cheek. Vikir frowned. Quote. What are you doing? Why, I'm the master. Do you have a problem with me touching mine? Vikir's mouth was half open in disbelief. But it would be futile to rebel against Ian now, not when he was so ill. You're so soft. Quote. So I'll just have to put up with this humiliating childish treatment for a while. On the night, Ian settled down on the cliffside directly overlooking Oxbear's burrow. They'll strike at first light tomorrow. Oxbear is nocturnal, so fighting him now would be a disadvantage. It was wisest to strike when the sun rose and he fell asleep. Ian and Vikir built a simple hut on a solid rocky area. A few branches, a leather cloth, and some broad leaves made a tent large enough for 3 or 4 people. Blow into it and white smoke billows out. This is what the indigenous people of Balak call the Cold Valley, a valley where even in May, the snow still hasn't melted. It's so cold here, even the mosquitoes can't come. Ian climbed into the tent and lay down. He lifted his leathers and turned to Vikir, who stood outside the tent. Come in here. Quote. Vikir was silent for a moment. He looked around and saw the harshness of the environment. The ground is cold and the soil is bad. Trees couldn't grow much, so where they had grown and died, only bushes and weeds sprouted in their place. With short shrubs rising up like a grate, it was not a bad place to camp for the night, as long as you were careful of the cold. Rustle. Vikir stepped inside the tent. Ian had dug a shallow pit in the new floor and piled leaves and sword fire in it. Crackle. A small fire blossomed. The light from the teepee warmed the confined space. True to its name, the valley became very cold at night. His face and arms were hot in front of the fire, but his back, head, legs, and toes were immediately icy. Beyond the crackling embers, Vikir thought of many things. The friends and companions he'd left behind in the age of destruction, all those faces. People he could see again whenever he chose, people he would never see again. Meanwhile, in the sea of fog outside the tent, dead trees, like human bones, rose and sank. Vikir is lost in thought over the dying embers of the fire. Boom! A sound breaks his reverie. He turns to find Ayan buried in Bakira's fur, inhaling something. It was a strong liquor, so strong that you could tell its strength by the smell alone. From a leather pouch, Ayan smoked a wide slice of jerky, slathered in white fat, and ate it as a late-night snack. It looked like buttered bread, but the flavor and calorie count would be far different. After a long pause, Ayan looked back at Vikir. "You should eat it, it's good for you." "I don't have jerky," Vikir replied, and Ayan waved his hand dismissively. "Oh well, don't worry, it is a master's virtue to provide for his slaves. I've even brought you your share." Vikir cocked his head. Ayan's leather pouch had contained only one piece of jerky. It had just gone into her mouth. Just in time. Ayan cupped both of Vikir's cheeks in her palms. Then she shoved her face into his. Vikir didn't even have time to protest. Ayan kissed Vikir on the mouth, spilling the liquor and jerky in his mouth. Gulp. Vikir swallowed the liquor and meat in one gulp. Phew! Only then did Ayan pull her face away from Vikir's. She stroked his chin with the back of her hand and smirked. "You can't chew this jerky with your current jaw. It's very tough." "I'm sure it is." Vikir frowns. The jerky that remained in his mouth was so tough that he had to draw on his mana to chew it. With a Hun's beating, Vikir hadn't been able to eat anything other than porridge or tree berries, so this was a nice nourishment. Suddenly, Ayan's eyes widened. Somehow, she had ended up sitting on top of Vikir. In the cramped confines of the tent, Vikir could do little more than struggle beneath her. Ayan's face is flushed red from the firelight. She stares down at Vikir with an oddly heated smile. "You can't even rebel, can you? Because it's heavy." "It's not heavy." "I said it's heavy." "I'm not heavy." "I said I'm heavy." Ayan was silent for a moment, thinking hard about something, and then he said, "It's not that I'm heavy, it's that you're weak." With that, Ayan smiled a smile that seemed strangely pleased. Vikir saw it and gave up on the conversation. Maybe it's the language, but he can't read her emotions right now. "The first thing I need to do is recover quickly." He had to if he didn't want to be manipulated. "If I could regain my strength, I could easily subdue this little fellow and leave the jungle. And the best way to do that was to sleep." Vikir closed his eyes. Ayan leaned in close enough to touch his face with the tip of her nose. "Are you itchy? Put your hand here. It's the place with the most heat. In return, I'll put my hand on yours." As Vikir's hand slid between her chest and armpit, Ayan paused to drape her body over his. Ayan's expression quickly turns to bewilderment. "Are you asleep?" The answer came back, too scared to speak. Vikir had fallen asleep in that brief moment. He can fall asleep in less than a second when he lies down, a skill that has been practiced by martial artists throughout the age of destruction. "Huh." Ayan pouted her lips in disbelief. She slid off Vikir's body as if offended and lay down beside him. Then she rolled over and crossed her arms, her own hands trapped between his chest and armpits. How dare you be insolent? A dull slave, inconsiderate of his master." Ayan continued to grumble. Only Bakira, the wolf with her ears to the ground, is looking at Ayan with a pitying gaze. "What is it? Why are your eyes open like that?" What? I was just cold, I wasn't trying to do anything else." Just as Ayan and Bakira were about to argue. Bam! Vikir, who thought he was sleeping, instantly jumped up. The momentum was enough to make even Ayan and Bakira flinch in surprise. You didn't sleep." Before Ayan could open her mouth, Vikir spoke. "It's coming." Something clicked in his senses that hadn't been there for a moment. Suddenly, Ayan's and Bakira's expressions stiffened. Suddenly, an inexplicable wail rips through the night. The oxbear male had attacked this wave first. Chapter 59 The Hunter and the Hunted 5. Alas! Vikir scrambled to his feet. His bones screamed at his unhealed joints, but he had no choice. If he didn't move now, he would be killed. The tent I had built shredded like tissue paper. It was the oxbear's powerful claws that tore through the night. Ian chuckled in amusement. You were lured, weren't you, you sneaky thing? A male oxbear. Even if he was only half the size of the female, he was still a very large carnivore, standing over 4 meters tall and weighing over a ton. This seasoned beast already knew it was being tracked. That's why it had waited to strike while it was weak. Ian quickly grabbed her bow and arrows and retreated to the outside of the tent. Bakira, the wolf, crouched low beside her master, snarling. Ian studied the oxbear before her. I see you were chosen by the old female for a reason. The giant female oxbear before him had been very picky about her second year, and he was a little puzzled as to why she had chosen this one, who was unusually small among the many males, to be her mate. If it was simply because she didn't want to be attacked after mating, there were plenty of other smaller males available. But now I understood. She wanted his cunning intelligence to complement her superior physicality. The oxbear lunged at her with 2 massive horns and both front paws. Ian climbed onto Bakira's back and quickly knocked an arrow to her bowstring. Ping! 2 arrows fly, aiming for the oxbear's face. The oxbear ducked his head and lifted his horns up, so they couldn't hit him in the face. The arrows then deflected in midair as if they were alive, striking oxbear in both shoulders. Indeed, Balak's archery was the best on the continent, and Ian's was the best of all. Ian strung multiple arrows from a single bow. Unusually, Balak's bow has multiple nocks. The arrows on each of these nocks can be staggered and fired back to back, or they can be fired all at once. Ian fired arrow after arrow, barely pausing to breathe. The time it took for the first arrow to fly, followed by the second, third, fourth, fifth, and so on, was a blink of an eye. A truly monstrous rate of fire. Of course, pulling 5 arrows at once requires a ridiculous amount of arm strength. The enormous tension required was covered by Ian's low-level graduator mana. The rain of arrows slowed Oxbear's charge. Each of Ian's arrows was so powerful that even the Oxbear's thick muscles and furry hide could not defend against them. What's more, Ian's arrows didn't just travel in a straight line. She shot them upward, sideways, and sometimes even backward. Arrows that went up would fall in a parabolic arc and hit the top of the head, while those that went sideways would curve back and hit the side. Arrows that flew backwards even hit trees and rocks, sending grenades flying. Moreover, the arrows carried a powerful aura. Oxbear had no idea how troublesome this aura would be. Oxbear ducked behind a bush to avoid the flying arrow. The brambles were quite thick, and he thought they would block the arrows. But a good arrow will pierce steel if it wants to, but it will not pierce a leaf if it does not want to. Ian recalled a lesson she had heard from her mother-in-chief, Aquila. Next, she let loose an arrow, which struck the high bush where the oxbear was hiding. Surprisingly, the arrow, traveling at such high speeds, didn't hit the bramble and bounce back. Instead, the arrow's aura left the arrowhead and soaked into the brush. And then, boom! The oxbear hiding behind the bramble spewed blood from its neck. Penetration. The intangible energy from the arrowhead went beyond the barren tree and gouged into the oxbear's body behind it. Vikir gasped at the sight. Indeed, that is the archery of the Balak. A ridiculous archery skill, capable of killing even an enemy behind cover. But the skilled hunters of Balak actually do it. Vikir had moved mana to shatter a table and the glasses on it without destroying it, but he didn't know if it could be applied to flying arrows. If it can be done, it would allow for more precise aura control. Vikir lifted his head again and looked at Ian. 17 years old and a low-level graduator. Even in Baskerville, where only geniuses live, I've never seen a prodigy this young. In terms of talent alone, he could probably rival or surpass even Morg Camus. But it was the oxbear that made even Ian nervous. An immature, small male, weak after a prolonged mating. But even so, the danger rank A beast was strong. Ian gritted her teeth as she realized she was almost out of arrows. Bakira, the wolf who had been his steady companion, was also exhausted. It's cold, the terrain is simple, and it's a moonless night, making visibility difficult. Now, with all the advantage, Oxbear is ready for the final blow. The Oxbear's typical attack pattern consists of a horn charge followed by a large swing of its front paws. But it's the tooth attack that follows these two moves that really makes the difference. Hi-ya! The Oxbear charged with all its might, opening its wide arms to embrace both Iron and Bakura at once. Its dagger-like jaws were lined with teeth, ready to rip Iron's head off. What do we do? We're running out of arrows. Do we retreat, or do we make one last gamble? As Iron contemplated his next move, something happened that neither Iron, Bakura, nor even Oxbear saw coming. Move. Vikir. He had appeared. Vikir, an unwelcome intruder into the battle. He was perched on top of a tall branch. Then Vikir kicked off the branch and leapt, falling straight down to Oxbear. Ow! What are you doing? Iron was horrified. What Vikir was doing seemed to her to be nothing less than suicide. But then, as Vikir leapt from the tree, he clutched a handful of arrows. And surprisingly, Oxbear didn't react much to the sight of Vikir falling. That's because Vikir's jump was to the left. Not long before, the male Oxbear had received a slap on the cheek while moping around in the female's den after mating, and his left eye was swollen shut. It was an exquisite dig to fill the blind spot. And then, several arrows in Vikir's grasp pierced Oxbear's left eye at once. Cheat. The sound of fat boiling, the smell of burning meat was unmistakable. The arrowheads had been loaded with Iron's mana not long ago, and were heated to the limit. The hot shards of iron tore through the Oxbear male's swollen snowball flesh, popping his tender eyeball and sending the bundle of nerves inside scrambling. Oxbear's scream changed slightly. Its roar, once a mixture of hatred and contempt, was now tinged with fear. Vikir snatched the arrows out of her hand and dropped to the ground. The mere act of landing on the ground seems to shatter his entire body. The Oxbear loomed in front of him, its enormous body looming over him. Iron gasped in horror. No. She quickly fired an arrow, but it only pierced some of the Oxbear's strong back muscles. Bakura the wolf lunged and bit her hind paws, but Oxbear was unperturbed. Blinded by rage and fear, Oxbear opened his mouth in a guttural roar. No horns, no front paws, just teeth. The Oxbear's true breath attack flew toward Vikir, and the expression on Vikir's face as he faced it could not have been more serene. Quote. This is not a death wish. He's gauging whether his body can handle the technique he's about to use. Come out, Vikir ordered in a low voice, and the faithful hound bared its teeth. A black awl pierced the artery in Vikir's wrist. The magic sword, Beelzebub, had been unleashed. With the sound of a fly's wings, Beelzebub revealed his appetite for the giant hunk of meat in front of him. And with that, one of the powerful forces trapped within Beelzebub's 3 orbs exploded through the tip of his sword. Less than the gluttonous fly, Beelzebub, greater than all. -1 slot. Burn, Cerberus A+. Cerberus, the 3-headed dog that symbolizes hell itself. Roar. The oil-based flames, which could not be extinguished by water, combined with the aura of Beelzebub's blade and exploded. Fueled by the oils of hell, the flames burned endlessly unless their master's will was extinguished. The fiery hound's teeth sank back into Oxbear's gaping mouth. Oxbear stopped charging. His eyes, blinded by rage and fear, finally opened to the reality of the situation. What the hell is that? I thought it was just some human blood, but it wasn't. What you see before you is a gigantic apex predator, the presence of a high-ranking demon that you dare not compare to, the fangs of a monster that belongs in the deepest hells of the netherworld. Wherever it has been lying in ambush, the creature that has just bared its teeth is upon you, bringing untold pain and terror. A short, guttural sound. The awl that sprouted from Vikir's wrist shot out and pierced the Oxbear's mouth. First, it pierced the hanging tongue, then the gums, then the palate, and finally the brain in the skull. To make matters worse, the tip of the awl emitted a terrifying flame. The most terrible pain in the world, burning pain. It was boiling the brains in Oxbear's skull to a crisp. Oxbear let out a near-terminal scream. Vikir's attack was short, but intense. The Oxbear was still clinging to life with its characteristic toughness and regenerative powers, but that was all. No, that wasn't all. In the last moments of its life, Oxbear leaned its massive body toward Vikir. Vikir struggled to move from the pain he felt throughout his body. Even in death, Oxbear intended to use his massive body to crush Vikir to death. But, at that moment, Ayan threw her whole body and grabbed Vikir. Bakira the wolf scooped up Ayan and Vikir with her fluffy back and stepped back. "Are you okay?" Ayan's eyes widened, scanning Vikir's entire body. Vikir nodded with difficulty. At the same time, the Oxbear giant's head slammed into the ground. The last words of a male who, only moments before, had been frantically mating with a female in the cozy confines of his den, could he have imagined such an end? In the jungle, where looting, death, and love mixed together. The downfall. Ayan pulled Vikir into a hug. She hastily tore off the few strips of cloth that covered them, shouting, "Tell me. Tell me if you're going to die. We need to get the seeds out of." Vikir couldn't help but sigh at the success of the hunt. Chapter 60. The protagonist of Hunting 1. The Plunder Festival. A great festival was held in the village of Balak. In fact, every day is a celebration for the Balak, but on a day like today, when meat is plentiful, it's unusually loud. When the vines are cut, clear water pours out and pools in a large stone pot. Into the boiling water were thrown lobsters, freshwater crabs, zaras, turtles, carp, catfish, venison, rabbit, squirrel, snake meat, caterpillars, beetles, ants, frogs, lizards, water grass, berries, mushrooms, and tree roots. A huge stone pot bubbled in the center of the village. All the small game that Balak's hunters have gathered is thrown into it, simmering into a rich broth. Everyone in the village gets a fair share of the broth. Larger prey, such as deer and boar, were roasted separately around the stone fire. Everyone would gather around these large hunks of meat, singing and dancing merrily. In the midst of all the noise and excitement, it was a huge hunk of meat in the center of the village, even bigger than the stone oven, that caught everyone's attention the most. An oxbear, a giant, six-legged beast weighing a ton. Without the bones and fur, the pure meat weighs over 800 pounds. This giant hunk of meat was the star of today's hunt. Naturally, the hunter who captures the oxbear earns the respect, admiration, and gratitude of all the villagers. That would be Ayan and Vikir. How does it feel to be a hero, slave? Vikir didn't say much in response to Ayan's question. She smiled and patted Vikir on the back. An oxbear is a very honorable prey. They're strong and fierce, but they're also intelligent, unlike boars, whose eyes are dark, whose movements are slow and simple, and who are so scared they shit and scream when they run. Ayan shouted as loudly as he could, hoping someone would hear him. Then he heard grunting and grunting from beyond the campfire where the meat was roasting. It was a Hun, who had killed a fairly large boar. Holy sh*t. I don't know how a dying creature could have gotten away with this. He must have gotten incredibly lucky. A Hun spat once on the ground and glared at Vikir. Then a Hun picked up his knife and cut the oxbear's meat into small pieces. A Hun then handed the meat to the villagers lined up in a row, and then to Vikir, who stood behind him. Vikir's expression frowned slightly as he accepted the meat. The size and weight of the pieces of meat given to Vikir were dwarfed by those given to the others. Even less than what the frail old men and sniveling children had received. Vikir raised his head to protest. "What are you doing?" Then a Hun looked up, annoyed. A puzzled look on his face. Rather disgusted, he retorted. "What are you talking about, you slave? Why is my meat so little?" "What? No wonder. Because your honor is so high," a Hun bellowed. Vikir gave him a puzzled look, and Ayan, beside him, broke out into a wide grin. It is a Balak tradition. The one who contributes the most to the hunt takes the least. In return, he receives an amount of honor equal to the lesser meat. If you can trade honor for meat, you have a great deal. A Hun nodded in agreement. "Damn, part of me wants to give you a lot of meat, too. But you gotta give credit where credit is due." Judging by his grumbling, he really does want to give Vikir a lot of meat. Well, the less meat he gets, the more honorable he is. Vikir decided that meat was better than honor that was worthless, but for now he could only nod. It doesn't really matter. Though the meat was scarce, there was enough food to fill his stomach if he so desired. In fact, the real harvest of this hunt was not meat. Less than gluttonous fly, Beelzebub, greater than all. -1 slot. Burn, Cerberus. A+. Slot -2, sacral spine, oxbear A. Slot -3, tight throat, infernal buffalo A. New skills gained from capturing oxbear. One of the 3 orbs of the magic sword Beelzebub is imbued with the hardy soul of the male oxbear you killed last night. The hellhound's soul is gone, and the spirit of the stronger, higher-ranked oxbear is Vikir's new slave. The skill of sacral spine was simple and effective. By holding your breath, you could increase your weight by a ton. It's a pretty versatile skill for close combat. Not only that, but the experience from killing the oxbear was infused into his body, restoring a significant amount of health to his entire body. Skills and experience. Vikir was mentally calculating the results of this hunt. Come on, Ahun. That's quite a kill, don't you think? Ayan broke Vikir's reverie. She had brought several kilograms of foreleg meat, a jar of blood, and the heart, liver, and gallbladder that were Vikir's share of the bounty, reserved for the best hunters. Ayan lifted the meat and waved it in front of Vikir's eyes. Narrowing her eyes, she spoke with a burdened air. Just as important as the hunt is the preparation and preservation of the kill. Ayan wanted to use the grooming as an excuse to stick close to Vikir and interfere. But there was one thing she didn't know. Vikir had slaughtered countless demonic carcasses during the Age of Destruction, and his skill at removing their entrails, flesh, bones, and skins to preserve and cook them was almost masterful. Chuckle, 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 chuckle. Vikir soaked the hides in water in a wide bamboo vat and scraped away the fat behind them with a sharp stone knife. The hides, which came off without a scratch, were set aside for tanning. When dry, the hides were as hard as planks, but softened after a few beats with oil squeezed from the scaffolding. The oxbear's flesh, guts, and blood were boiled in a pot, and the oils that floated to the top were skimmed off and used to light the lanterns. The bones, claws, and teeth were used to make weapons and jewelry. Meat as a whole was cooked in a variety of ways. Some cuts were made into jerky, some were boiled into soup, some were boiled into tang, some were lightly poached, some were smoked over charcoal, and some were hung to dry in nodal. Vikir was particularly good at smoking large pieces of meat whole. Some of the people who watched Vikir work on the meat were dumbfounded and left their meat to him. Among them was Ayan, who had come to learn how to handle the meat. Vikir tied the large chunks of meat to salted rope and hung them from a branch. He then dug a pit and let the meat dangle in the center of the pit, and at the bottom of the pit he piled pine needles and oak and apple wood and lit a fire. Once the fire was blazing, Vikir gathered branches, leaves, and mud to seal the opening of the pit. After a while, he broke the mud lid, which had hardened under the fire, and pulled the rope to reveal a browned, smoky chunk of meat. A whole oxbear hind leg was roasted. The Balak people raved about the deliciously smoked hind leg barbecue. Ayan's eyes widened in amazement as he cut into the meat. What the hell can't you do? Nothing too extraordinary, given the age of the soul, but certainly surprising, given that the body was no more than 15 years old. Vikir watched the younger children eagerly pick at the chunks of meat, blowing on them. The exuberance of young children is something that puts a smile on anyone's face, regardless of age. Vikir watched as the people ate the meat he had roasted. There was a slight quirk in the way the people of Balak shared their meat. Those with bad eyes ate the eyes of an oxbear. Those with bad lungs ate the lungs of the oxbear. Those with bad legs ate oxblood legs. Those with bad pancreas ate the pancreas of the oxbear. The tribesmen seemed to believe that they could cure their ailments by eating the parts of their prey. Strange superstition. Vikir thought to himself. Hey, slave. Vikir hears a voice calling to him from the side. Ayan, who had slipped away after the dismemberment had begun, was standing behind him when he reappeared. Cheeks burning, a large bowl of coconut in his hand. The steaming bowl was filled with a hot, bubbling broth of oil. Inside was a large chunk of meat, elongated and thick, making it hard to tell what it was. Organ, I asked, though I couldn't tell exactly what it was because it was floating in a cloud of grease. Ayan snorted and said, I've taken what the shaman covets with the authority of a hunter, and this is for you to eat, by all means. I have already received a piece of meat, a jar of blood, and some entrails. No, 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 this is for you to eat. Ian insisted on feeding Vikir the meat soup. Her logic was adamant. If your eyes are bad, eat the eyes of your prey. If your heart is bad, eat the heart of your prey. If your hands or feet are bad, eat the forelegs and hind legs of your prey. What part of the oxbeer is this? When Vikir asked about the identity of the long, thick chunks of meat in the bath, Ian only coughed and offered no explanation. HMPH, seeing as how you've been sleeping around in the cold, you'll definitely need this, eat some. Ian mumbled the last part and swallowed it whole. Reaction erupted around him instead. Boo Captain, you're already taking what's yours. Who gives that to a slave for his own good? Ho ho, the season of long nights is coming soon. That's too blatant. It's obvious what she's up to. The young women of the village booed Ian in unison. Shut up, girls. If you're not happy, you can go out with your lasso and get him. Ian raises her fist, her eyes glowing, and the heckling dies down. Quote. Vikir frowned, not quite sure what to make of that. Well, I'll take what I can get. Vikir gulped down the hot broth. He chewed and swallowed every last bit of the coarse meat that had sunk into his stomach as Ian kept urging him on. This is so tough. The texture itself was similar to the haggis he was used to eating in Baskerville, but it was much more savory and chewy than that. Gulp. Vikir's throat gurgled loudly once. Only then did Ian's expression soften. I see. Now you're going to give me an excuse. Vikir frowned slightly once more. I think I've already given you more than your fair share of hunting. He couldn't quite figure out what more she wanted here.